I'd like to just ask a question or two. How many of you work with senior executives who are labeled as abrasive or even called bullies, and as part of your EAP, and as part of, say, assessment and referral, and brief counseling or extended counseling, and how many of you have executive coaching associated with your EAP? Okay. So really, this presentation is about when you receive a call from management, almost in the old supervisor referral, or maybe it's still here, voluntary supervisor referral format, how do you structure it for success? And I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about myself and my personal epiphany. So roughly in the neighborhood of 20 years ago, I was sitting in my office at Blue Cross, and I got a call from my manager to come down and talk with her. So I went down the hall, and I opened the door, and sitting there with her was the Vice President of Human Resources, whose office was 3.5 hours away. And being the fast study that I am, I realized that this is probably not good. And in fact, they proceeded to tell me that I was being terminated for mismanaging my budget. And I was a little confused because I had been putting in requests to see a breakdown of my overhead for the last 4 months, because I knew there was something wrong with my budget and I never got it. About a week later, I was in Einstein Brothers Bagels, and the woman who was from the finance function, who was my partner in developing the budget, came over to me and said, "Jordan, I owe you an apology." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, you know how for the last 6 months you've been telling me there's something wrong with your overhead, and I've been looking at you like I haven't got a clue what you're talking about?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "And do you know how you asked at least 3 times for a breakdown of your overhead and I never gave it to you?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I knew what was going on, and I was told by our boss that if I gave it to you, I would lose my job." And it occurred to me that I had a really good excuse to be victimized, to feel victimized and bitter for the next 10, 15 years. And I just hate feeling victimized and bitter, so I decided to do what I teach my clients to do, which is figure out what I controlled in the situation and what I could have done differently. And as I sat there and thought about it, I realized that I knew that my boss wanted more deference from me than I was giving her. And I knew that was true, and I knew that working the 60 hours a week I was working, it was going to take a lot of energy to manage that. And so I didn't think I had the energy to do it, number one. And number two, there was this conversation in my head, which I've had since my upbringing in New York City, that I don't know why I should be respectful of somebody who doesn't deserve it. Also, it's not as if I hadn't had mentors, supervisors, and a therapist or two along the way tell me that I need to get more diplomatic and tactful. And it wasn't that I don't have the language for it. I'm a trained therapist, and I was a trained EAP person. So it wasn't that I didn't know how to do it. It was more that I didn't want to waste my time with it. I allowed myself to not deal with it. And so I decided that the process for not feeling victimized was to treat this as if I have been slapped over the head with a 2x4, that it's no longer okay for me to behave this way. And I made a commitment that regardless of what my brain was telling me about whether or not the person I'm talking to is deserved of respect, compassion, etc., that I was going to make a commitment to treat everyone with respect and compassion. And that was the big epiphany, that it is not about, I should have known this, I'm a therapist, I'm an EAP counselor, all of that, but somehow it didn't occur to me that it was about my lack of commitment rather than skills. And once I made that commitment, people who know me from back then think that they don't quite think I've become like Gandhi. But I've moved significantly. And I will tell you that most of the people who know me now, who've met me in the last 3 to 5 years, think that I'm a little bit too direct. I could be a little more tactful. But the difference is really significant. I do periodically have moments where I get triggered and stuff comes out of my mouth that I've committed that I'm not going to do, but that happens. The other thing that occurred is about 2 years ago, my friend Robert McClure, whose name you should know, is the head of the EAP for SHARP, or he's the recently retired head of the EAP for the SHARP health system, got trained at Stanford in their compassion cultivation model. And so what this added to it is I now have the core purpose that I am going to try, I am committed to recognizing when people I'm dealing with are in pain or suffering and doing something to alleviate that suffering, even when my brain is telling me they don't deserve it. And ultimately, that is the key to working with abrasive executives, that you have to find some kind of intrinsic motivation with them, for them, so that they are changing because it's the right thing to do and not because they're getting pressure from outside. The key driver of all of this is, are you committed to that? Are you committed to a core purpose? So the objectives today are how to structure a assessment and referral, brief counseling, extended counseling, or executive coaching engagement for success. How to form an alliance with the executive who has been labeled abrasive or even been called a bully. How to leverage the external motivation for them, and how to increase positive outcomes with executives who are experienced as abrasive. One of the things I recognize is, as I started to do this, that I was using exactly what I had been taught in the EAP field about how to set up a voluntary referral, a voluntary supervisor referral. I don't think there's anything up here that any of you don't know. I will tell you that it kind of took the coaching field aback, that I would set it up and have meetings with the boss and have the boss tell the employee what they need to change and how I would do it. What I'd like to do is just very quickly review the elements of the engagement before going into how do you leverage intrinsic motivation. So the first thing is that the boss needs to communicate clear expectations and consequences for continuing to treat people in demeaning and disrespectful ways. Anybody, that's a surprise for anybody? Okay. Is it a surprise for anybody that most of the time they haven't done that? Okay, so a lot of times they haven't done it because they are conflict avoidant themselves, or because the person is very valuable and they don't want to lose them, or for a variety of other reasons. And when I am retained to do this, they want to hire me to do it. And the way I set it up is I say, if there is no intrinsic motivation for this person to change, meaning that they wouldn't ultimately change because it's the right thing for them to do, then this is going to fail. So I'm going to set up a pilot project, and it's usually like 6 to 8 hours, and part of that is I do some assessments. Really, the primary reason is to give them enough time to vent about how unfair and politically correct this is. And then I basically say to the executive, this is a 6 to 8 session pilot to see if there's any intrinsic motivation. And by the way, if in my personal judgment there isn't, I'm leaving. And then we decide that the executive needs to be evaluated on whether they change their behavior, not whether or not I leave. And then I communicate a positive model. Challenge, denial, and rationalization, mine for intrinsic motivation. Some assessments, stakeholder input. There's a certain number of folks who just don't have a clue the amount of pain that they're causing, and who are totally shocked if I were to do 10 interviews and summarize them and give them back what people are saying about the impact that they're having on their lives. Set goals, development plan, counseling, coaching, teaching, and a stakeholder evaluation at the end. So that is sort of the model. It can be as short as 10 to 15 sessions, hours, or as long as 30 to 60. And it really depends on the person, what they need, and it partly depends on how much the organization values this person and wants to invest in them. These are some global models of abrasive behavior. The literature and most of the people that I know who work with abrasive executives call them names. Like bully, like narcissist, like jerk, and like some other more colorful bodily part descriptions. It occurred to me after reading this book by Laura Crawshaw called Taming the Abrasive Manager that she makes loud and clear the point that, that calling them names is doing to them exactly what you want them to stop doing to other people. And that it's not compassionate, it's labeling, and it's just not the right thing to do. Also, it doesn't work. So here are some commonly used terms for bullies. So I'd like to shift a little bit to some more positive models of motivation. The first one is winning. I want to be number one. I want to kick butt on our competition. I want to get paid more than anybody else. As they mature, that becomes, I want us to be number one. The second one is achieving great things. Could be turning this company around when nobody else can do it. Could be curing cancer. Could be ending poverty. By the way, there are a lot of nonprofit senior executives who I have met who are quite abrasive, and it's not the profit motive that does this, in my opinion. It really is how much are these things attached to your self-esteem and sense of well-being. The third one is serving, to serve others. I don't think you can be successful in an executive position unless you have some of all three, but clearly one will lead over the other. And in the case of most executive directors, Laura Crawshaw's estimate is that about 96 to 90 to 100%, 96% of executives to 98% of executives do not want to hurt people. What is going on with them is that their self-esteem and their sense of well-being is tied to those three things. When the people around them do not perform, show up late, don't think things through, don't have accountability, they experience it as a personal attack, almost as if somebody were holding a knife against their throat in a dark alley. And so you've got some fight-flight response going on. And they strike back. But the intent is not to hurt, the intent is to protect themselves. I have experienced about 2% of the people, and I've probably dealt with somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 or 150 over the last 10 years, who really enjoy hurting people and get pleasure out of it. So, but my experience is it's a very small percentage. About a year ago, I started volunteering for the Honor Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization which helps special operations forces transition from military to civilian life. And on the surface, it's about how do they get a job, but this is an incredible program. And they spend the first 6 weeks doing what they call youth school, which is understanding that these guys and some women don't know how to talk about themselves, because in their culture you don't. It's about we, it's not about I. And so they help them figure out essentially what is your core purpose. And then we work with them on how do you talk, and et cetera, et cetera. And I did not serve in the military. I grew up during the Vietnam War, and the war ended, the draft ended right around the time I graduated. So this is my opportunity to serve. And I have learned some things, not that I didn't know before, but that have just really struck me in a way that they never would have when I was younger. So I'd like to review with you the ethos of the Navy SEALs and ask you how many of the people that you coach who are abrasive have these characteristics. An uncommon desire to succeed, forged by adversity, accept the responsibility of their chosen way of life, take charge, lead my teammates, and accomplish the mission, demand discipline, expect innovation, and I am never out of the fight. Does that sound like your guys? Okay, so one of the thoughts I have is that rather than calling them names, they ought to be respected as warriors, because that's what they are. There's an interesting piece of information that I got from the SEALs. I got to attend a 2-day post-traumatic stress disorder conference. And one of the things that got said is that the reason that people in the military, one of the reasons people in the military have trouble transitioning is that they are transitioning into a culture that is less healthy than the culture they were in. So particularly for special operations forces, but for military in general, it is not okay to do something to take care of yourself that hurts the rest of your tribe. It is not okay. It is not okay to leave weak and injured people behind. It is not okay to do any of those things. And in our business environment, it definitely is okay and accepted and not challenged a whole lot. So part of the reason they have trouble transitioning, again, is that they're being asked to transition, accept, and feel comfortable in a culture that's not as healthy as the one that they're coming from. So that really woke me up. The second set here, I have found very mixed in the groups that I coach, very mixed whether they could check these boxes. So the first one is I have uncompromising integrity. Just out of curiosity, how many of you who have coached abrasive executives, or I prefer to say executives experienced as abrasive, find that they have uncompromising integrity? Okay, much less. How about loyalty is beyond reproach? We live in a culture where it's okay to do for me. If I don't think you have my back, I can do whatever I want. My character and honor are steadfast. My word is my bond. Here's a big one. I expect to lead and be led. I don't think so. I lead by example in all situations. I will never quit, I persevere, and I thrive on adversity. A lot of them have that. I find that some of them have the uncompromising integrity. It's been my experience. And a lot of them have the loyalty. So this is, I would say, a mixed. Now I'm going to take you to the third group of commitments, and in my experience, almost none of them have this. So I humbly serve. The ability to control my emotions and my actions, regardless of circumstance, sets me apart. I place the welfare and security of others before my own. I defend those who are unable to defend themselves, and I will draw on every remaining ounce of strength to protect my teammates and to accomplish our mission. So there are really two pieces to leveraging the intrinsic motivation of the executive. There is a gentleman that I coached years ago who was the head of research for an international manufacturing company. And he got referred in because he was kind of edgy and difficult. I wouldn't say, he never cursed at people. I said to him, as I shared with you, that the first part of this is about my determining whether you have intrinsic motivation. And if you don't, I'm leaving. I didn't say it with that tone of voice, but that's basically the communication. I don't know about you, but my experience is if you don't do something like that, they come in trying to prove that you're an inadequate coach and you don't know what you're doing. So the first part, so again, that first part is to explain that, by the way, I've discussed this with your boss, and if after 6 to 8 hours in my professional and personal judgment, you don't have enough intrinsic motivation, I'm going to leave. And I've told your boss that you should not be disciplined, or it should not affect your career if I leave, that your boss should only evaluate you on whether you change these behaviors. So that's pretty powerful. And typically, I don't want to hear about the background. I don't want to hear what their goals are. I want to hear them tell me why they are intrinsically motivated to change. Now, what typically happens is they need 2 or 3 hours to vent on how ridiculously politically correct and what a stupid situation this is. And I will tell you, I think part of the reason that I am able to work with them around that, there's several reasons. The first is I was raised in a city housing project in New York that was built for returning war veterans. So it's not Fort Apache, the Bronx. It was all working people. And I came away with 3 values. One was integrity. Second one was accountability. And the third one is I don't know exactly what to call it, but I call it reality, which is don't accept what appears on the surface, get down there and find out what's really going on. And I usually tell them that. I also tell them that I once got fired for being abrasive. So there's a connection piece. But more importantly, I tell them, and by the way, this is 100% true, and if we have some conversation about this, that will be fine, that we live in a society that some schools, for instance, will not let kids play tag because the person who is it will have their self-esteem damaged. And that people who are the target of this kind of behavior are considered victims as opposed to targets. And there isn't an expectation that you learn how to deal with that. So I am not in any way saying that demeaning, bullying behavior should be tolerated, but I am saying that there is a lack of accountability on the part of the targets also within our society. And so I communicate that. I do think that it's not the most terrible thing in the world, and you know, this is from a former executive who was fired for his tone. So I still think it's not the most terrible thing in the world for somebody to get a sarcastic remark from somebody else who's their boss and not break down and fall apart. On the other hand, at the same time, I also recognize that compassion is important. So if I sound like I have a couple of conversations going on in my head, I do. The other piece that I do is and I've been doing this lately, I've only been doing this for the last 1.5 years, but I've been reviewing the ethos of the Navy SEALs with them. And I have been applauding them and honoring them for their warrior spirit. However, their incomplete warrior spirit. I find that it's far more effective to challenge them to become better warriors than to tell them that they're behaving badly and that they should change because they're not being appropriate to society. When they know for sure that the people around them are also not behaving as they should behave in teams and in organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a sense of unfairness. So this gentleman that I was starting to tell you about came in, and I had that conversation with him, and we started digging around for intrinsic motivation. We were talking, and he was looking for his intrinsic motivation, and I said, let me ask you a question. And he said, what's that? And I said, do you believe in a higher power? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, well, tell me about that. Do you really believe in a higher power? Do you believe there's a higher power operating in your life? And he said yes, and we talked about that a little bit, and somewhere along the line I became convinced that actually this is a person who is a true Christian. And so I said to him, this is what changed the case. This was what cracked it. I said to him, is it possible that God has put you in the middle of all of these obnoxious, lazy, irresponsible people so that you could learn tolerance, love, compassion, and forgiveness? And there was dead silence, dead silence. And immediately, it was similar to my own experience. Immediately, overnight, there was a major change. Now, he needed ongoing coaching because, you know, you get triggered and it doesn't go away. As those of you who know neuropsychology, what's being taught, you have these neural pathways in your brain that continue to operate for years, and it's essentially you're building a new path that isn't quite as strong as the other one. So periodically. So I once got this call from him. He was sitting in an airport, and he was on his way to China. And he had had this interaction with his boss, who was quite the character. And basically he called me and said, I need your help, because after what happened, when I get off this plane in China, I am going to call him and tell him what I think, and I will be fired before my own time. So I need your help. So we had been talking about the compassion cultivation process. There's the commitment. Are you committed to developing compassion? The second piece is, if you are committed, what's the cognitive conversation? What do you say? And typically it's, may you be free from suffering if you're trying to have compassion for somebody who is in pain, who you don't like or who you do like. May you be free from suffering. May you be free from anger and hostility. May you be free from fear and anxiety, and other things like that. And so in this case, usually what I do in working with them is I tell them about compassion, and then we work on figuring out what are the people who really annoy you suffering from. So in this case, he was so angry, all he could come up with is, my boss is suffering from narcissism. Actually, the term was being a narcissistic. So we worked on envisioning that. I had taught him some relaxation, and he had done some practice with this. So we got off the plane. I heard from him about 3 days later. He said, well, I didn't call my boss up, but it was close. And he basically spent most of the trip meditating, breathing, and imagining, trying to work up some genuine feeling for wanting to help his boss be alleviated from being a narcissistic ass. So that's kind of the feel. This is how I define the types of no bullshit leaders. The first one is the warrior, and these are masters. They are incessantly driving for improvement. They're focused on quality and results, and yet they have enough compassion that they are able to produce, design, create a high-performance environment. The two people who are my idols for this, and I've never said this in public, so I'm curious as to what your reaction is. The first one is the old Gibbs from NCIS. How many of you think he's a warrior? How many of you think I'm full of it? Okay. The other one is Hetty from NCIS, New Orleans. Now, both with Hetty and with Gibbs lately, they've sensitized them more. But I'm talking about 3 to 5 years ago. He and Hetty were my two ideals for who is the warrior executive. The scientist is really an engineer, somebody who's very interested in facts, figures, experiments, usually uncomfortable with social interaction. And there are some of them who do tend to be abrasive in the sense that they do things that are demeaning and disrespectful, but most of them that I've bumped into just don't have people skills and they don't want to connect. So that's a second category. They don't have negative impact on people with strong self-esteem, but you do get complaints from people who either don't have strong self-esteem or who have much higher people needs, dependency needs, if you will. The third one I'm calling the abrasive executive. The abrasive executive may or may not be committed to success. So I've met a number of them who are just into, they're not so bad as what I'm calling the bully. And by the way, I recognize I've been thinking about what do I call the bully that's not calling him or her a name. And I haven't been able to come up with something. So the abrasive executive, in most of the cases, is committed to achieving optimal results. And he or she, but mostly he, has their self-esteem attached to achievement, success, recognition, all of that stuff. And they do tend to react as if they're being attacked when people don't perform well around them. That's been most of my experience. The last category is perhaps 2% or 3%. They just enjoy, they get pleasure out of hurting people. And it isn't like the abrasive executive doesn't get a little bit of pleasure when somebody gets something that they richly deserve, but it isn't the same thing. For your materials, when you get these, I put up Laura Crawshaw's categories. I particularly like her annoying boss. It really appeals to me. And then there's the aberrant boss, which you typically don't see that high up in Fortune 500s. So she's got a nice set of categories as well, and it can be helpful to work with someone who is a target and help them define which category is this. With the exception of going after core purpose and perhaps feeling comfortable teaching leadership models, processes, and making suggestions about options that they have, which you wouldn't do as much as a therapist, what you are doing is a nice transfer over to executive coaching. And there are a lot of executive coaches who are being taught that coaching is just asking questions. It's not teaching information, it's not whatever, and the executive coaching field, for the most part, thinks that's an inappropriate definition of what executive coaching is.